Welcome to this presentation about how public educational and government access channels are helping communities during the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Mike Wassenaar, and I'm the President and CEO of the Alliance for Community Media and its foundation. If you don't know us, we support and represent nonprofits, educational institutions, and local governments that operate PEG community media channels throughout the United States, and we have members in 42 states around the country. You can find out more about ACM and our foundation on the web at allcommunitymedia.org. Throughout the United States, in small towns, isolated counties, urban centers, and suburban communities, PEG channels provide key and consistent local information about government events and services, education, and community life. In the last 6 weeks, ACM has been collecting hundreds of examples of how PEG community media organizations are serving the public during the current crisis. Today, we'll talk about what's happening on America's channels as PEG is responding to immense community need. And we'll look at concerns we have moving past the first days of the COVID-19 emergency. Responding to community need is not new for our organizations. In fact, we exist because of how the Telecommunications Act enforces the power of local communities to assess community information needs during cable television licensing, so that resources, primarily channel capacity and money, can be devoted to producing local programs and training local media producers. We are seeing enormous strain on local information systems as a result of COVID-19. And I'd argue that that mechanism of local control and local information creation that PEG channels represent is needed now more than ever. On this presentation, I'll talk more about that a little bit later, and I'll take questions from people who are joining us live today. So go ahead and use the chat area for your questions or observations or your own experiences of response to COVID-19 if you're watching this live today. For today's presentation, we'll talk about the central challenges that channels and communities face and the key responses that we're seeing. The responses can be classified, so far as I see them, as emergency information and local news, remote capacity and training, education and distance learning, and the social and spiritual connection needed for isolated communities. I think that PEG organizations and channels are at the crux of a dilemma that we're seeing right now during the COVID-19 outbreak. Stay-at-home orders and social distance measures in states around the country have effectively shuttered the public face of public access organizations, much as libraries, community centers, theaters, and exhibition spaces have all been closed in the last month and a half out of public health concerns. So staff at PEG centers and channels across the country have by and large either had to adjust their studio operations, which are deemed to be essential service, to observe social distance, or they've deployed remote work strategies to ensure that channels maintain operations and local content is still being created and distributed to cable viewers and to other platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and other over-the-top solutions like Roku. That's happening as there's been an explosion of demand for local information and local connections during the course of the crisis. Channels are reporting record use right now and increases in requests for production services during the outbreak across the country. That includes PEG channels that have no public space functions, channels that are educational and government access channels, but who still face the same dilemma of having to reinvent themselves while they tackle enormous public needs for information, for connection, and for meeting. So how are operations reacting to this conflict? What we've been seeing this last month and a half is characteristic of what really is the best, in my mind, that defines PEG channels, responding to local needs with the resources at hand to better the lives of people at the local level. There are some extraordinary stories and some remarkable achievements we want to talk about over the course of this hour, and that's happening to our people even under increasing workloads and demands. We'll talk about that. That said, we also have to recognize that we're only in the first chapter of the COVID-19 story, and we have to find ways to ensure that local media is strengthened rather than weakened by the stress test that we are all under. We'll talk about that during the course of this presentation. So here are some of the response trends that we're seeing across the country. We're seeing channels supporting critical emergency information and news functions. City and county governments are being supported by channels in their effort to get out public safety and emergency communication to local residents in thousands of communities across the United States. They're also serving as aggregators for state and local information that's COVID-19 related. That could be daily press briefings, discussions with local public health experts, or programming about assistance for residents and businesses that are particularly affected by COVID-19. Let's give you some examples. In one case, vital public health and information is being transmitted in non-English language, being produced through a collaboration of public television and access television in St. Paul, Minnesota. That collaboration actually got its start close to 20 years ago as a result of public health concerns following 9/11. And in some ways, it was created for a moment just like this to ensure that all residents, regardless of their language use, are informed so they can be safe during a pandemic. Another example of public health resources being produced for diverse communities in need is in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I'm speaking today. Here, we're seeing health reports in Korean produced by the county's Department of Health and by Montgomery Community Media. And in another case that illustrates, I think, the potential for our channels, local reporting has evolved into a daily news program. That's occurring on the islands of Maui and Molokai. The Maui Daily is being produced by Akaku and has been produced daily since March 20th to provide press conferences with the mayor of Maui, local correspondence submissions from around the islands, and interviews with people across both islands, which very much represent a news desert environment. This has been a change for the center, which has really stepped up its game in terms of producing news content and delivering content that is immediate for the needs, information needs of residents on the islands. We believe this actually could be a very important development that could be replicated across the United States and really needs to be watched. The next area that we're monitoring is open government and meeting technology. Maintaining transparency and open government at a time of limited physical meetings is a core question for local government and for PEG channels across the United States. ACM feels that maintaining open government is essential for preserving our democratic norms during a crisis. And believe it or not, we're finding many local journalists depending upon those video feeds from PEG channels to allow for coverage of local government in the first place. It's somewhat ironic, but it shows the interdependency of local journalism and local government in 2020. Channels have been rapidly integrating remote meeting technologies such as Zoom, WebEx, and Google Meet into their workflows in the last 6 weeks. This has actually increased meeting coverage for many communities, as organizations are now able to distribute technical resources virtually and to hold 2 public meetings or more at the same time, something which would have been cost prohibitive in the past. This has been enabled by equipment companies that serve our industry along with technical experts in our field. Companies like Cablecast, Telview, and Castus have all worked closely with industry engineers to work on system integration and provide workflow solutions for PEG providers to be able to meet that need, and we really want to thank them for stepping up in that effort. Here's some examples of what we're seeing across the country. Take as one example Brookline Interactive Group in Brookline, Massachusetts. They've really been accelerating their meeting coverage as a result of the COVID crisis. Dozens of meetings have been facilitated during the crisis in an effort to make sure that public meetings are both safe and open. That work isn't easy. Our members can attest to the biggest obstacles that they face to make remote meetings possible on their channels. It's the education of committees, elected leaders, and the public as to how they effectively use these innovating meeting technologies. They can be deceptively simple, and they can cause people to run into problems as they're trying to do their business for local democracies. It's essential that we act as facilitators in that work to ensure that more meetings can be held during the course of the crisis, and meetings can be transparent to the public. Another exemplary story that we see comes from Goffstown, New Hampshire, where the sole employee of the city's channel has actually been quarantined for 3 weeks out of concern for possible COVID-19 infection. Despite this, Goffstown TV has been running remote open meetings from his own dining room The meetings aren't happening in the dining room. He's actually administering the technical work in his dining room as a result of his own ingenuity and his determination to make sure that local democracy still works in his community. And some of our organizations are also using their expertise to train nonprofits, government officials, and educators, and other members of the public as to how to meet remotely so they can ensure that small d democracy continues. Here's an example from Gresham, Oregon. Metro East Community Media is a great example of this kind of public education work on different types of technology platforms. This is actually a core practice amongst PEG centers across the country and has been for many, many years, and it demonstrates the need for this public education function that we provide to be able to ensure that transparency continues and actually grows during 2020. A third important area of impact that we are monitoring across the country is education and distance learning. As school districts have closed across the country, PEG channels have increased their power as education resources for local schools, for families, and for children. In recent days, initiatives have been announced using public access channels to reach diverse communities in Baltimore, Maryland, Savannah, Georgia, the Bronx, Boston, Massachusetts, and Lafayette, Louisiana, just to name a few. While a great deal of public policy discussion regarding remote learning right now is necessarily circled around the digital divide and distance learning resources, educational access television remains a key tool in the public arsenal of reaching Americans during the course of the outbreak. Here's some examples. Look at the city of Baltimore, where public schools CEOs recently said that they knew that they could not rely just on Chromebook distribution for distance learning efforts in the city because of the diversity and disparity in technology use in the populations that the school are serving. Therefore, they're working with a combination of both distance learning products online and access television resources available to a more diverse group of learners in the community. The same can be said in Boston, Massachusetts, where Boston Neighborhood Network has been partnering with the schools for quite some time to provide daily lesson support on their channels to a very diverse group of students. And just this past week in Lafayette, Louisiana, the Acadiana Open Channel has partnered with the regional United Way to launch Learn United, which is an effort to create what is essentially a portal for educational content for educators and learners throughout the region. These are all great efforts in highly diverse school districts that seem to understand one thing, that you need to have a multivalent approach, a multi-layered approach to communication with families and students as learning must continue in a very, very difficult circumstance. We're really in the early days of this work, and I believe that we'll see a lot of more innovation taking place in this space as we prepare to resume education more fully for all our residents in coming months across the United States. So look at the space as it's developing. Our channels are also providing social and spiritual connection in a time of dramatic isolation, both physical as well as metaphorical isolation. That social connectivity of place has long been a hallmark of access television. When former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps referred to our channels as the beating heart of localism, he might have been referring to that soul of connection that drives so much of the work of community television. Whether we're talking about workout videos in Chaska, Minnesota, or poetry slams in Brooklyn, access channels are providing activities for local residents to engage in what they can do when the public square has been shuttered by this crisis. Here's some other examples. During the Holy Week and Passover season this month, we have seen PEG organizations increase the training of local faith organizations and increase their efforts to partner with the faith organizations so they can provide live streams of religious events or produce programs directly for their channels. Some examples include Sunrise Service in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Holy Week live streaming in Winchester, Massachusetts, nearby. BNN in Boston has been another key provider here, providing Passover services for elders who were prevented from being with their families during the holidays. And we should also mention that Acadiana Open Channel in Lafayette partnered with the local diocese to carry Good Friday services live, both on streaming and on their channels. This goes above the service to faith communities that we normally see on public access television throughout the United States. Another aspect of connection that we're seeing is channels providing profiles of local small businesses to ensure that those businesses survive this crisis. Here's an example from BronxNet of small businesses that make up Little Italy on Arthur Avenue, a famous place if you've been to the Bronx. It's just an example of a PEG channel acting like a lifeline to their community to ensure that folks are connected with local businesses so that those businesses can survive through commerce during the course of the crisis. And that same can be said for what we're seeing in a very innovative initiative in Champlin, Minnesota, where QCTV has partnered with local musicians to produce charity performances to ensure that artists can earn a living during the crisis when music venues have been closed. The relief sessions have actually generated thousands of dollars in support for those musicians so far, and they are providing needed entertainment for local viewers in need of some cheer in what can sometimes be very, very stressful times. Those stories just scratch the surface of what we're seeing across the country, and they're inspiring because of that innovation that's upwelling from local communities that want to respond to the needs of our neighbors. We also have to mention that there are challenges ahead, and it would be short-sighted for us not to talk about them. So let's actually focus a little bit about challenges that we face. We have some questions about whether or not the energy and effort that we're seeing in this time of crisis is sustainable. Organizations and staff have expressed to me and to other colleagues across the country that the stress of what is occurring right now is actually essentially emergency communications work. It's important that we support the mental and emotional health of our colleagues as well as the physical health of our colleagues as they're doing this essential work for communities at PEG channels across the country. We're also concerned about the long-term financial impacts that may occur for most channels. For example, PEG Community Media is dependent on the financial health of local government revenue and fees derived from cable television. It's not clear how either will fare in the coming months as a result of COVID-19. For example, will cable subscriber rates continue to fall, or will they change more dramatically due to effects on consumer spending and a possible recession? Subscriber losses, or perhaps viewers switching to broadband only as a service, will further reduce support for local information needs that come through PEG channels. Local government financial health, meanwhile, is very much threatened at this point as a result of the crisis. Local government budgets sometimes are a lagging indicator of possible recessions and economic disturbance, so we haven't seen radical changes in budgets yet, although many governments have begun considering furloughs for non-essential workers to save resources or are considering cuts. A recent poll by the National League of Cities found that something like 88% of municipalities across the country are considering budget cuts as a result of the COVID crisis. This is not just because of the lack of resources. It's also because more resources will be needed for direct needs like medical care, housing, emergency assistance, food assistance. And we will be seeing substantial losses in tax revenue in coming weeks due to drops in sales, tourism, and income taxes in out weeks and months. I expect that this will put local government under an immense financial strain, and it could jeopardize spending for local information needs through PEG channels like ours. Layer on top of this the context of local journalism and information being under threat to its fundamental existence. News deserts, we know, already exist across the United States. The loss of local information is actually accelerating with the COVID-19 crisis due to the disappearance of ad revenue and the closure of local businesses. One estimate is that 30 to 50% of all ad revenue will disappear in coming days. I'm going to say that again. 30 to 50% of all ad revenue will disappear for local media. The crisis is being described by some analysts as an extinction-level event by some people who are in the news industry. We should be concerned about how local information ecosystem failure will have an effect on our communities for a host of reasons, for the nature of our democracy and also for the relative information that's necessary for citizens and members of the community to make good decisions in their daily lives. Given that context, diversification of revenue will be very, very difficult, if not impossible, in this environment. and the needs of our channels to be news sources will only be heightened in coming days. Now, much of the discussion of policy response to the COVID-19 crisis in the realm of telecommunications has been on the necessary area of bridging the digital divide, providing equipment and low-cost internet to millions of Americans who are not online or don't have the privilege of being online to be socially distant in their daily lives. That's a vital need, but it focuses on only one aspect of the information ecosystem, receiving information. We have to focus on sustaining the production of local information as a public good, and PEG Community Media fills a vital part of that system. What can be done? Well, we think that Congress, industry, and philanthropy can help in coming weeks. ACM and other organizations are urging Congress to adopt definitions in the Telecommunications Act that allow for flexibility so that nonprofits and local governments can better meet information needs that are critical in this time. For example, the Protecting Community Television Act, H.R. 5659 or S. 3218, that have been introduced by Representative Anna Eshoo of California and Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, ensure local governments and nonprofits are not subject to clawbacks by the cable industry, so franchise fees can be spent on serving the community in this critical time. As well, similarly, the cable industry or Congress could release the restriction on PEG grants to allow local governments and nonprofits to hire local workers to produce content and news rather than have funds solely be directed to the purchasing of equipment. We also believe that PEG operations and all community media operations should be eligible for economic resources that support journalism, local information production, and government transparency during the COVID-19 crisis. This includes future efforts for rescue funding that are being proposed by advocates that come from the federal government or from philanthropies in hopes of bailing out newspapers, local broadcasters, and other information providers. We believe it's necessary that community media organizations like ours be involved in those efforts because the need for relief will extend, we think, to our local communities. We're still really in the early days of COVID-19. I think that's important to remember, even though it may seem like it's gone on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Public closures in America really only began the second week of March. And here we are on April 15th, really, I think, beginning only to see the public impacts of the crisis in communities across the country. We really don't know what the future looks like. It's unknown in many instances, and the challenges that we face may seem enormous as we outline them here. But we do know from what we've seen in the past weeks from communities across the country, from ACM members, and from public educational and government channels across the United States, that ingenuity and the spirit of local community can endure and grow in times like this. Our channels are devoted to that spirit, and we really look forward to what lies ahead in the coming days and weeks as we do our work in community. So with that, I want to open up questions and considerations from attendees. So if you've got questions, why don't you go to the chat bar and bring them up in discussion here as we have time to talk about what we're seeing across the country. So Tom writes, if the FCC is considered making any changes, particularly to the law, and we have not heard anything from the FCC on that. Brian asks, can the release of PEG grants from capital language be added to the Protecting Community TV Act? That's possible. It's also possible that it could be a separate piece of language, and actually it may make it easier for the Protecting Community TV Act to be enacted, because the Protecting Community TV Act only talks about the definition of franchise fees, and thus it's a very simple piece of language. In some ways, it's easier to write simpler pieces of language to be attached to bills than to create what are essentially greater bills that are more complex, that could be defeated by different parts of industry. Here's another question from Matt. would changing the rules for PEG money allocations for capital to unrestricted backfire and allow communities to put those funds into their general operating accounts and budgets? It's very true, Matt, especially in a time of great financial distress. And I think that's probably a danger for us to be thinking about as well. Challenge, I guess, is probably a good way to put it. A danger in that you could be seeing unrestricted monies simply being put into direct need of first responders, direct needs in terms of housing and food assistance in a time of recession. I think what that means is that we have to be very, very clear about the value proposition and the worth of the public information that our PEG organizations are providing, and we actually find ways to be able to make sure that we fund those public needs and see that support of that public need is essential, not something that's simply frivolous. We have to be defining the work that we're doing as essential and thinking about the ways that organizations like yours and others across the country are indispensable. That's the reason I think why, for example, you've been seeing some organizations stepping up their game to produce local news and other efforts across the country. Alan writes that we need to be realistic. With only D supporting the Protect Community Television Act, only an election will help. You may be right, Alan. I think it's important for us to make sure that we're making that case on both sides of the aisle. And we're continuing to advocate for Republicans and Democrats to be co-sponsors of the act. If your organization has not been a part of that advocacy work, ACM is here to help, and we can actually provide resources so that we can help make the case to both Democrats and Republicans that the Protecting Community Television Act is necessary to help with these vital information services that people are providing across the country. The other thing that's important to note is that the act probably has different chances of success depending upon the different houses that it's in, and also it could be attached to different forms of necessary bills that to pass over the course of the next 8 months. That said, the Alliance for Community Media will not tell you who to vote for in November. However, you need to probably be informed about what politicians would have the most benefit for your services to be delivered across your community and across the United States. And elections do have consequences. The President of the United States, for example, does appoint the majority of FCC commissioners, and both the House and the Senate compositions do have something to do with whether or not this legislation will be successful. So yeah, Alan, realism is necessary. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be advocating on behalf of the act, regardless of whether or not you're in a D or an R district. If you've got other stories to relate or questions to ask on the chat function, please do so, and we'll be happy to talk about them here. If not, let me remind you about ACM's next webinar. It'll be on May 20th, 2020. It'll be taking place on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be talking about podcasting and building a podcast studio. Actually, we'll be talking about resources that organizations can be looking at and ways that podcasting can be a resource for your community. That'll be taking place next month, and that's sponsored by Comrex. So please join us for that podcasting webinar. You can sign up for the webinar by going to the ACM's website, allcommunitymedia.org. Brian asks if ACM can create an online repository for sharing educational resources that we're creating for our communities. I believe we can, and I'm happy to talk with you more directly about that. Brian relates that CMAC in Fresno is happy to share video tutorials that they're making. We've got the ability to share with our colleagues over the listserv, but things can sometimes get lost in the mix. It would be good to have one place where we can easily collect and share resources for education in our communities. We're happy to do that, Brian, and I'll talk with you after the webcast about that. Another quick reminder, we'll be publishing this resource on the ACM website following the broadcast, so please go ahead and share it with your colleagues and also with folks that want to find out about what PEG is doing in your community. You'll be able to find that at allcommunitymedia.org. As well, I'll give you a copy of the PDF for the PowerPoint as a result of the examples that we had during the course of the webcasts. So expect to see that in your inboxes in the next day or so. With that, I want to thank you for joining us on today's broadcast. This has been a free service of ACM. If you want to sign up for other ACM webinars, go to our website, allcommunitymedia.org. With that, thank you, everybody, and have a good day.